Good afternoon. We're ready to get started with our special lecture on video art and context with Professor Shannon Jackson and
Professor
myself.
Greg Niemeyer.
Thank you. Yes. And this is our sum up of a full semester of a course on video art and context with many visitors. And we're just here today to give everybody a sense of what we've discussed, but also what we discovered amongst ourselves and through each other, and what we discovered through your powerful work. So let's get started. We're going to start with actually a set of questions, because we know each other as professors, and you've known us as professors, but you don't really know us as authors, and or as people who just care about something and have cared about something for their entire lives. And so I wanted to ask you, what did you care about when you were 21, and how did that lead you to where you are now?
Okay. So we'll also think, first of all, Greg and I were born the same year. So when I was 21 was also around the same time you were 21.
That's correct, yes. Yeah.
All right. So when I was 21, I wasn't doing that yet. When I was 21, I was an undergrad still at Stanford, across the bay. The daughter of parents who met at Berkeley, so eventually I found my way back. And I was very, very much a humanities geek. I majored in something called modern thought and literature, and I was also a theater geek. I was in performances and theater pretty much every term, every night. So my life was studying by day and rehearsing at night. I was always in a show, whether I was acting or directing. So that was my point of entry into the arts. And then gradually, I had this sort of moment all throughout undergrad. I would identify kind of as an artist, but I was also, as I said, sort of a researcher geek, loved to write and research, and I always thought I had to choose between one or the other. And I started to realize from meeting professors and meeting various artists that I might be able to keep on doing the thinking and writing and researching, and also some kind of making, some kind of performance making. And from there, post-21, I ended up applying to a PhD in performance studies, going to Chicago for it, and worked in this field, performance studies, that students here have heard me talk about, that integrates theater, dance, also experimental performance art, but also things like ritual, parades, protest, storytelling, even everyday acts of how we conduct ourselves, what good manners are, what bad manners are. That's all a type of performance. And so I was really interested in performance's role in our wider culture. So that always was my point of entry. I ended up, now we have various things. I ended up really doubling down on this scholarly thing and writing several books around performance, the role of performance in social change in the 19th century U.S., also thinking about performance in higher education and the role that it's had throughout the 20th century, whether in public speaking or in theater or drama. Another book around art and social change was social work, and that really became a very important thing for me, is really thinking about the role of the arts in something like social change, or as we've talked about it here, in social intervention. And what is it that the arts bring to issues around gender or immigration or environment, et cetera. So those were books. Oh, and you have the clicker. And more books that really thought about these types of connections, thinking about performance specifically, but about the arts and social change. I did have the privilege of writing at one point a book about a media theater company, a new media theater company called the Builders Association, who you've met, and we had them in residence here in Berkeley in the 2000s, in the aughts. And as part of that, they built a huge new project that combined screens and live streaming, or early versions of live streaming or pretend live streaming, into the theater space, into a space like this. And that led me to be able to really think deeply about their work, and I wrote a whole book about this theater company that was joining the screen, the stuff of the screen, and always thinking about ever new technologies and the impacts of new technologies, but using those technologies inside of a theater space, which in some ways disrupted the theater space and also made you think anew about these technologies. So cell phones on stage, or call center dialogues on stage. So that became a little bit of a point of entry, I think, for me to eventually get to this place now of being able to teach around video art, which is a newer field for me just only in the last 5 years, really trying to teach myself. And the thing about being at Berkeley is we can work with various students and various colleagues so that we can learn new things that wasn't my specialty, say, 10 years ago. But I will say one other trajectory for me is in the next slide.
Oh, but before we move on, do you mind if I ask you a question about this cover that says public servants?
Sure, yeah.
So I guess you called it public servants because you see artists such as Marianne Weems as public servants and as people who serve the public in a certain way through the arts. And can you spell that out a little bit more? Like,
yeah.
What actually, how do you measure the impact of an artist in terms of serving the public? Can you measure that, or is that the wrong question? Or how do you account for it?
I wouldn't do measure, yeah.
But maybe
how do you account for it, yeah.
Account for it. How can we account for it, yeah?
Yeah, so Marianne Weems' Builders is not in that book. This book, though, Public Servants, really came after this book, Social Works, and it's an edited collection with two other curators and directors in museums. Joanna Burton is now the director of MoCA in LA, for those of you who come from Los Angeles or know Los Angeles, and Dominic Wilston, who also co-edited, is the director of the ICA in Richmond, Virginia. And what we were really thinking about, actually, are artists who, something that's super important to me, artists who engage the public and even the public sector and public institutions as institutions that we need, even if they are ever imperfect and in need of constant reformation. So in a certain trajectory for thinking about the role of the arts in social change, sometimes I got a little frustrated if artists or social change only looks like social change to some when we're storming the castle, when we're taking down the man, when we're launching a protest that sometimes is trying to sort of take down the institution. And there's been a lot of really important social movements that are about taking down the institution, and arguably even the free speech movement here at Berkeley was that kind of a movement. But I started to worry a little bit at times, especially around 2008, 2009, when we had a fiscal crisis throughout the United States, but also in the UC system, where it started to feel almost like, if we're not careful, many of us could find ourselves arguing for the taking down of the UC system, the taking down of a social welfare support system, food security support systems, various things that we actually might need in governance, even if they're so imperfectly run. So we became really interested in public servants and decided to call it public servants in order to embrace the headache and burden and opportunity and genius of what it is to be in service to the public in whatever way. And we chose artists who really think deeply about public service, about the role of the public sector, however imperfect, and about governance and how to really reframe governance in terms of its activism, et cetera. So in terms of accounting for it, what I think is, like, as we've talked about here, it's not, to me, about only, quote, measured in terms of an artist's capacity to make a policy change, which has happened in many of the projects that we analyzed, but also actually when artists come in and reframe or help us think anew about something that we think we understand and actually realize we don't. So a lot of times the artists are in there saying, this is your conception of what, of where your taxes go. This is your conception of what it is to inhabit a city. This is your conception of the role of immigrants or not in our society, and that the artists come in to sort of tweak and reframe and create different principles for connection and sometimes disconnection with issues that we think we understand and maybe actually need to know better with more complexity.
We'll come back to that.
We will.
Also the policy change. Let's move on to the next slide.
Okay, yeah, so more public projects, and I also love being part of big collective projects too. Some of you guys know about the Media Art 21, but also these are other websites that I've co-curated. One called In Terms of Performance that might be fun to play around with. Okay, but then the next slide is where I wanted to go. So, I look so young because I was. This is in 1992. It was when I was in graduate school in Chicago. This is, I would say, another way I end up having a kind of loose, unexpected relationship to and trajectory towards something like video art. I did a lot of performance and gradually started to do a lot of solo performance. And a performance that I created and ended up performing quite often throughout the 90s was a piece called White Noises. And it was a piece of really about white privilege. And especially at the time in the 90s, about really trying to create fora and opportunities for the acknowledgement by white people at the time of whiteness as a race identity. That, again, this is a dated concept, or I wish it was a dated concept, but the whole notion that being white is being normal, that the whole notion that white is the unmarked thing around which everybody else's markedness revolves, to really trouble during the 90s at that time, that sense, and to really specify what it is to, what the habit of privilege is, and to mark it, and also to acknowledge it, and to confront some of the guilt or defensiveness that keeps somebody like me who identifies as white, has had the privilege of being raised white. What does it mean to acknowledge that and acknowledge a habit of privilege that by definition you're not always aware of at the moments that you receive it.
So in 1992, that seemed like an early time to make that kind of a statement. How did it impact your colleagues around you? What did people think of it? Were they shocked? I mean, today it seems like that's the conversation that still is going on, right? And but it seems like 92 was an early time to do this.
Yeah, maybe.
So you're the first, maybe.
There was definitely writing at the time, Richard Dyer, others who talked about whiteness as a category. And and also it was a huge part of social movements around race and gender within feminist movements, really thinking with Black feminists, African-American feminists. Kimberly Crenshaw was writing about intersectionality around then. So it was really about what was it to be what would now be called the language of allyship at that time. So I don't know that was early. It was just sort of me trying to respond to that moment. What is weird and strange to me really is, as I say, I think of this as a dated piece. And oddly, I wish it was more dated than it is, that it keeps on, these issues keep on coming back, and that sort of, you just can't stop teaching yourself and others, sort of the need to reconnect and understand again. So we have now new books like White Fragility and others that are remaking some of the arguments that I felt we were confronting in the 90s, and I guess we have to keep confronting them again and again.
So do you remember a line from that piece?
It's always hard to tell a story, especially because sometimes, gosh, do I?
You can do it.
Okay.
We're with you.
Okay. It's sometimes hard to tell a story, in part because in the moment that you were experiencing it, you didn't know you were in a story. And so, hence, you didn't know it had begun, when it all began. I think you should have it published. I think you should consider having it published, but you should at least send it to the Black Theater Network, that essay contest for the Black Theater Network. This suggestion from a professor of mine about an essay that I wrote. Okay, I just started to do a little bit of it, but it's no, not at all. Yeah. I think that the other point is that it was a performance that was videotaped randomly, thankfully, by a friend who happened to have a video camera, and he happened to do it from beginning to end. And he said, Shannon, we should really, tape this. So I said, okay, fine. So we taped it. So this was in the 90s. And then I performed it quite a bit, but then stopped performing it. In fact, the last time I performed it, I think it was in 2000, and I was 7 months pregnant with my first child, and it was hard to perform. But in terms of getting breath and all that, and that was the last. That was it. Then in 2005, a curator named Hamza Walker, who was then at Renaissance Society in Chicago, but is now the director of LAX Art in Los Angeles, decided to do a show about race, and he titled it "Black Is, Black Ain't," and utilized. And if you can read here, you can see some of the selection of artists that were in this exhibition. Some really, really formative, amazing artists who are working deeply and in complicated ways around issues of race. Some of them I've invoked here in class. So Hamza called and asked if he could include my piece in his exhibition. And I was like, you mean I would come over to Chicago and perform it on opening night? Or he said, no, put up the video in the piece, in the exhibition. And I said, oh, I think I have a video, but I guess, and I went, trolling through all of these different boxes and finally found this very fragile DVD that actually wasn't even on that. It was on some other little funny reel built inside of an early camera,
High 8 or something?
High 8. And we ended up transferring it to DVD, which was then what he needed. And he ended up installing it, much as we see here, in a kind of curtained space inside of the exhibition gallery, so that people could go and see all of these other art pieces throughout the gallery, and then they would go inside here and they would see the videotape of my performance. So I've talked to students here, to others in class, about how much video art has actually started randomly as documentation of a performance, and then it ends up in this other form, and in a way that's a kind of hack version that is also partly my trajectory. And I was glad that we at least had one, however imperfect video that I could be included in such a wonderful exhibition. But there you go.
Yeah.
That's another part of why I end up here.
Thank you. Yeah, and that reminds me a little bit of when Nikkei was speaking about when they were speaking about documenting performance and how that becomes a performance in its own right. And I understand their course is emphasizing that a lot as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the use of documentation as then the resource for a new art form. I'd love to make the piece now, maybe, it's still too dated, but into a true video art form. What would that be? Would be interesting.
Yeah.
So what about you, Greg?
Yes, well,
your trajectory. What were you doing at 21?
At 21, I was in Switzerland still, so far away, and I was studying photography. And as I was an art school student, I really was frustrated with the fact that photographs always stopped, whereas life went on. And the photographs, of course, freeze things, and you're like, but things changed after that. And so I had all these projects where I went to rephotograph things, and I also rephotographed places that people painted in the past. I did a whole thing about Van Gogh and how he painted in Arles, and I went back to Arles to photograph all the locations. And I noticed that the locations that he painted and made look so glorious looked really trivial, actually. They were still the same places, but they had, all the magic was gone, you know. All the magic was in the painting, and the places themselves just were devoid of anything. And so this constant tension between the reality we live in and the image we make of it, and also the worldviews that we build, and the way the world works, and how these things are not the same. That's what got me interested in going beyond photography and saying, well, I want to push against this limit. And so I started making pieces that had to do with really interacting with the world continuously. So speaking of performance, I have a picture here of a piece called Ping that I did together with my colleague Chris Chafe from Stanford, who's a wonderful composer, and this piece was simply about letting people feel what it's like to be at the center of a network and to see data coming in from different servers. And so that was 2001. That was part of SF MoMA's exhibit, Art and Technological Times. And it was a wonderful show, and we got to install this huge constellation of speakers and steering wheels and in one of the plazas of the museum. And at the time, they did things like raves in the museum. And so people started dancing on top of that thing, and eventually, actually, they danced so hard that the whole thing fell apart and had to be fixed the next morning. It was extremely embarrassing. But in a way, it was a success, because if you can make a work of art that works on a rave, that was pretty good. I was happy with that. And so people were dancing to the sound of the networks and the various speeds with which computers communicate with each other. And we had this one server in Mongolia that was really far away, and so low transmission rates meant low sounds. And so this one server in Mongolia always came in with deep sounds like boing, 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 boing. And then these other servers that were much closer by, like Google's, were like, and together they made kind of the heartbeat of the internet, if you will. And
so it was when you at one point you said visualizing a network, but it is the sound of a network. It's really was a huge part.
So I have synesthesia. So for me, visualizing and sonifying is all the same. And so we can really just say manifesting data. And that topic became the topic for the rest of my career, is how to manifest data in different forms. And in this case, it was live data. So it wasn't a database that we read, but just things that happen in the world that we were able to replicate. And it had to do with my feeling that I always had, which was to make a mirror that shows the world more accurately. And so this was kind of a mirror that reflected the internet back to us.
What year was this?
This was 2000, 2001. It was created in 2000 and then installed in 2001. And then this picture here is of another version of the same thing in Paris, in a place called La Villette in 2005. So we had several versions of it and traveled around with it, just like you with your performance. Traveled around with this piece quite a bit.
So when it was probably a big feat for you to be using live data, right?
Yes.
Yes. And did you have, I think in terms of the Builders Association as well as others, those that really actually got it live at the time, were people registering what it meant truly to have live data at the time versus people sort of assuming that you had recorded these sounds and were just mixing them?
That's something I've been rubbing up against throughout my entire career.
Yeah.
In fact, there were many pieces where, again, working with Chris Chafe, we made compositions based on live data. So there was an algorithm that took live data and turned it into music, and it sounded so much like music that people were like, there's no way this is live. This is somebody has composed this, and it's a beautiful. And so we had one piece called Oxygen Flute, where people would use air quality sensors to exchange CO2 and oxygen with plants inside a greenhouse. And people walked in and say, oh, this is wonderful flute music in the greenhouse. And I would say, no, the flute music is all generated by you breathing a certain way and by the plants absorbing your carbon dioxide and returning oxygen. And they're like, that's not possible. This is way too sophisticated to be done on the fly. But it actually was. And so of course, now we have video games, and we have a lot of compositional dynamics that are live, and so so we've maybe gotten more used to it. But yeah, people never realized it was them. It was their own data that was being represented back to them. So they didn't identify with it. They thought it came from somebody else or somewhere else. Yeah. So what else do we have here? So speaking of air quality, and you talked about environment. So one of the things I spent a lot of time with was around 2007. I made a project called Black Cloud, and this was a project to measure air quality with small portable sensors. And the idea was that we put sensors wherever people breathe, because at the time, I guess the EPA had set up air quality monitoring stations all around the nation in areas where they could get baseline readings of how air quality would change over time. And I remember calling an agency and asking them about how the air quality was affected by a fire in Santa Barbara. And they said, oh, we turned off the sensors because a wildfire was an outlier. And therefore, it didn't really qualify as real data because it seemed like an error. And this was in 2007. Now we know that wildfires are not outliers, and we'll get back to that. Yes. And it's become part of the new normal. And of course, now we know that we especially need to measure things when things go wrong. And it was part of a shift in aesthetic that I'm very interested in, where we pay attention to the things that maybe we don't want to see, and the things that make us really uncertain. And so this was an early start for that. And so we built this whole bunch of sensors, brought them to high school in Los Angeles called Manual Arts High School, and the kids ran around, put these sensors wherever they thought the air quality was bad. And after a month of doing this, they found out that the air quality was worst, guess where?
In their school?
In their school.
Oh.
And you know why? Because they had a habit of drawing graffiti on desks, and then at night the cleaning staff would come in and wipe off the graffiti with acetone. And so when they came back to school in the morning, the desks were clean, but the air was filled with acetone, and the rooms were not ventilated. And so this actually led to a policy change where the Los Angeles School District made sure that there was a new regulation that there were no more classrooms without operable windows because ventilation was necessary. And so that was an artist operating in the public sphere and producing some kind of a policy change. And then, of course, from there on, there were many versions of this, and many other people picked up on this idea that we measure air quality continuously and where we live, and not intermittently and where we don't live. And
also involving school children in being researchers, sort of citizen artists themselves.
Absolutely. The citizen scientists, that's the term that's very important. And many students went on from that class to become nurses, and there was a particular twist in their career trajectory because they were familiar with data as a source of expression. And so that was very important. Yeah, that was, and then later on it turned into a company that was called Aclima, and they produce air quality sensors and measure things all around the world now for Google as well, for Street View, so you can get air quality measurements in your Street View now. So,
wonderful.
Yeah. Then this is a still of a video I think we showed already in this class. It was about sea level change. And so again, with Chris Chafe, I worked on, so I was collaborating with Chris Chafe and many other people throughout my life. And it was always a feeling of collaboration that got me going, got me inspired, got me excited. And so here I was working with Chris on sea level change in the Bay Area, and that turned into a video called The Meter Tide. And I think we could play it here, but I think we're also running out of time a little bit, so we're going to not play the video.
A little bit.
You want to play a little bit of it? Okay, it has a cool beginning, that's true. All right. You're not sure this yet? Should we stop here?
Yeah, I'd love to ask you about it.
Yeah.
So, what you're, just even the decisions about what you're juxtaposing visually and sonically. Oh, here you go. Yeah.
Yeah, so this video is very interesting to me because we took 7 takes of it, of Khrushchev playing, basically data of 110 years of seawater level rise in San Francisco. And as you know from observing the shore goes, the sea level changes by several feet every day because of the ebb and tide. And so, however, that is a dramatic change that actually masks a far more dramatic but more minute change, which is the constant rise in sea levels in absolute terms. So on average, the sea level has risen in that period by almost a foot. And so that's a lot of water. And it's an enormous amount of water. And of course, we'll have to all deal with flooding in some ways at some point. And so many regions more so than ours right now, but already it's a huge source of catastrophe and displacement for many human beings. So this tried to acknowledge that the hidden signal in the noisier signal of the lunar cycle and the tide, and the more subtle signal of this epochal, epic time change in seawater level.
So it was two layers of time that you're juxtaposing here.
Yeah, so the 110 years, and then him playing through that data as a source of inspiration in 5 minutes. And what he did then is he made 7 takes with 7 different interpretations. And I couldn't really decide which one was the nicest one, so we decided that we would use an editing algorithm that was based on how much the seawater level changed accelerated at a given time, and how many storms there were. And so every time there was a lot of upheavals in the record, we reflect that in an edit decision, so that when there's a lot of edits happening between the 7 takes, then that represents a moment where there was a lot of instability in the sea levels as well.
Okay, well, interesting.
Did that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And also sort of where you're editing, how you're making that aesthetic decision based on also a social and scientific set of information.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll come back to it when we talk about montage later, about how editing is this formal strategy for artists.
Yeah,
that you're deploying it here.
So there's many other things we could talk about. I'm going to just end on I guess this is one piece that is a still image, actually. It's a photograph that is a photograph of a source of a river in France called La Lou, and it shows around it how much the change in the flow of the river, how much the flow rate of the river changes over a year. So it's a full year's worth of data every hour of how much water came through. And so it's not a video at all, it's a still image, but it's an image that synthesizes the visual and the data all in one spot. And then I had another image here that we'll get to later. So this brings us actually to some of the concepts that we learned from each other, yeah? Mm-hmm. So now I know where you were coming from with your performance studies, and you know where I'm coming from. And this is where we meet in the space of video art, where we ask these core questions about what constitutes a work of video art.
Yeah. So and what we wanted to do, too, is just both to remind you and all of the students who have been here about where we've been, but when Greg and I were so excited to teach together, and we had ideas about, we knew ahead of time what you're reading, what topics, what artists we're going to be visiting. And I think we had a lot of good plans, and also a lot of unexpected moments where we learned things from each other that we had not expected to learn. And so we thought we'd just isolate a few of these moments where I found myself saying, oh my gosh, you're going to say that right now? Okay, cool. I totally know what I'm going to say next Tuesday then, because we were learning and building from each other. So both to honor Greg and honor our time together, we thought we'd isolate a few that, just so you know, they weren't totally planned, some of these kinships.
So some new twists and turns, kind of like in a game of tennis, or you exchange things.
Yeah.
Okay. So go ahead. Yeah.
So I'll say. So of course we came by. And I'll keep on always referencing, thinking about these terms. We thought about some of them more than others at certain times. But one of the places that I started out, and I often like to teach, the the 17th century aesthetic theory that where those sort of early ideas about what painting does and what poetry and literature do, what statuary and sculpture do, and to also acknowledge the fact that when we're talking about video across the arts, which we were doing a lot in the first part of the semester, thinking about video's relationship to text, to image, to photo, that part of what we're doing is mixing what were often considered to be traditionally divided media. So students might remember I made them think about how painting is often understood to be a static form, capturing one moment in time, whereas narrative or poetry is understood to be capturing sequential moments in time, right? And that old idea from Gotthold Lessing, who's writing in the 17th century, if you go one more slide ahead, past the painting, I think we have Lessing in there.
He's writing about this, right?
Writing about Laocoon, and who is here, if you remember some of these slides, here sort of saying, some content is best represented all at once in a painting or sculpture, and other types of content is best represented in the time-based medium of an epic poem. And that part of what we get with video art, of course, is the combination of time and image, right? But what was so amazing was you deciding to put the Bellotto painting before that. Go back. Yeah. This painting is when you came up to ask people what did they see in this painting, and isolated the fact that we have all of these different moments happening in different parts around the ruins of this building, and that theoretically this is maybe a possible painting of a moment that actually could have happened, but you encouraged everyone to realize that there's city elders and architects and people flirting and making out or whatever in different moments, and that actually we have micro stories, temporal stories being captured here that probably is representing an impossible an impossible moment.
A synthesis, I would say, a condensation of many highlights and many lowlights as well, because it's a disaster that is being shown here, right? The aftermath of the invasion of Dresden by the Frederick, the so-called Great of Prussia. And anyways, he bombed the city, and this is what's left. And 5 years later, Bellotto was still trying to find his painting materials again, because his studio was destroyed as well. And he was eventually able to paint the reconstruction. So it's a thick moment as opposed to a thin moment. It's a moment that is really heavy and full of depth. And so a lot of video art indeed stretches time and makes us stop thinking in terms of narrative progression, but rather in poetic suspension, where we stand in front of something and we're absorbed by the fact that it's not going from one thing to another so quickly, but that we just have to remain in that deep moment for longer and reflect on things a little bit.
Yeah.
So it's a contemplative, reflective mode where we see many different time frames at once.
But that whole notion of using that idea of thick time, which is also William Kentridge, one of our visitors, uses that notion of thick time. It really just demonstrates how much how many different temporalities are in fact possible in the visual image, as opposed to only picking one, which Lessing, the inherited Lessing, was perhaps might have assumed, okay, we could just have to pick one moment for painting. In this case, no. Actually, we get them all there in this thick way, and the fact that you, number one, picked this painting, which was painted 1 year. Within 1 year of Lessing's essay. That was an unexpected connection, that you were going to show this painting when I was making students read that essay. Oh, and they're both, produced at the same time. And then also that these are both in different ways generative, we think, for helping people understand what the pivot of video art actually is.
And here I'd like to segue for a minute, because remember I just a moment ago talked about how photography frustrated me because it always described a world that had already passed, and well, when I saw your lesson quote and you talking about it, I realized that the struggle that I was experiencing as a 21-year-old was actually one that went back 300 years, and that I could have just read about it, and I would have been in such a better shape because I would have not felt so alone. So sometimes when you read text, you actually realize that there's a long history of thinking that comes before you, and also a long history of solidarity that can embrace you, and that's so important. And that's why we always emphasize the importance of reading, and broadly and deeply. Yeah.
So this thinking about thick time and multiple perspectivalism in a single work led us to create this piece.
Which you all remember, you all photographed yourselves there. That was a lot of fun. And we tried to take a picture of a group of people standing in the middle of the room. And it was all meant to be taken at the same exact moment. And I want to acknowledge Hisachi Mulkey, who helped make this happen, actually. And so it's not quite as smooth as bullet time in The Matrix, but it is the same principle that if you take an image at the same instant from many different points of view, you can suspend time and look at something from different points of view. And I'm struck by the fact that I was wearing kind of a set of tubes there to pretend to be Laocoon or something, and now I actually have the real tubes on here. So this was a bit of foreshadowing of what's going to happen next. So you never know how deeply real an image can be because it predicts an aspect of the future.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right, so another moment was when you brought up, and I think it was you first who brought up Frederick Douglass as the most photographed man of his time.
Yeah, that's correct, yeah. And and then we both were planning on speaking about this.
But we didn't know that.
We didn't know that, so there was a nice convergence there. Yeah.
So your thoughts at the time were around the reproduction of this image and his thoughts around it.
And the possibility of photography that he saw to illustrate I am a man, to illustrate that a black man as a full human being with a soul and history and the suffering and hope and a future, and the same goes for black women, of course, as well. And so that he reestablished the humanity of blackness through photography, and he saw the potential of photography as a way to reestablish it in the context of slavery. Of course, there never was a question about blackness and humanity being associated and being the same thing. But in slavery, there was a disassociation between blackness and humanity, and he helped underscore that the medium could end this illusion, end this travesty, end the scandal of and slavery, and say, no, blackness and humanity always were belonging together, and photography can prove that.
And so I had been wondering, and then once I saw you, I actually added, saw you referencing it, I decided to make sure that we actually had the students read Frederick Douglass's incredible essay, again, on Pictures in Progress, where he delivers and really thinks about the role of photography in terms of, he'll talk about it more indirectly, not about blackness per se, but he'll talk about the democratic potential of photography, and about how now many people of different classes and cultures can have access to the reproduction of their own likeness, as opposed to only the upper class who have portraits done of them. And so the power of that, next to also, we talked a lot about with Walter Benjamin and others about the power of media. This is an early thinker who's really thinking about sort of almost like proto-mass media, about what it is to reproduce imagery, and what the capacities of mechanical reproduction are doing democratically for connecting, but also disconnecting people in the world. And the other wonderful thing is our colleague in the UC system, Isaac Julian, who's a professor at UC Santa Cruz, but a major, major video artist, had also just recently done an incredible 10-channel piece called Lessons of the Hour. This is my picture of Isaac recently getting knighted by now King Charles. But in Lessons of the Hour, Isaac actually reenacts Frederick Douglass delivering that speech on pictures in progress. And so it's a video art piece that interrogates, you could say, the earliest of screen-based technology, you know. So it's a kind of, you know, a screen piece about, a serial set of photographs, you could say, about the history of photography. So I was planning on talking about Isaac, and you set me up and queued me up really well.
Yeah. Those were good moments. And also, it reminds me that photography really was invented twice, if you will. Once it was invented as a photochemical process, and even that was invented by several people at the same time, Talbot and Daguerre. But then it was also invented socially in terms of what it can do for people. And so that reminded me of a conversation I had with Nick recently, one of our students, about how technology and politics and social agendas always co-constitute each other. So the media we end up using is both is a synthesis of political and social agendas, but also technical abilities. And so it's actually very complicated to separate these two things from each other. And the topic came up in many ways, where we looked at Portapack, the influence of early portable video in terms of giving people a voice to visualize their points of view beyond the broadcast medium of television, and to diversify access to video images. Yeah, and so so it's interesting how a technology can both serve to kind of concentrate power in the hands of a few, such as in broadcasting, but then a twist on the similar technology, just making it portable and accessible, suddenly democratizes, and now we all have cameras and channels by which we can view and share each other's lives.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the more of Isaac Julian, that was an amazing installation at the Minnesota, at McAvoy Foundation, right, for the arts. And that takes us to another conversation we had about montage, where we looked at Eisenstein's 5 types of montage. And Eisenstein was a Russian film author and also theorist who in the 1920s described these 5 cases of putting videos together. And earlier in the video about the water, we saw a very unusual way of editing film, which had nothing to do with our intention to convey something, but rather was quite structuralist. So that was probably falling into his first category, the metric kind of cutting, which is very structural, or rhythmic maybe. And then there's all these other examples that we brought in, and they helped us unpack a little bit and also construct our own video editing styles. And then we added another element to that, which was the layering of video, which is a technique that Jeffrey Gibson used a lot, and a technique to show 2 realities at once, one on top of the other. And it's something that Eisenstein didn't have much access to, because he was more interested in sequencing one thing after another and having that synthesis, the layering happen in the mind of the viewer. But now, of course, we can do that with video technology and digital technology. We can layer many videos on top of each other and therefore build a z-axis in the sense of depth in the image that we didn't have before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that for me, I just so appreciated you queuing up, thinking about montage, especially we were doing it at a time that the students were thinking about their own editing style, and then anticipating masking and layering. And I'll just sort of say for me that it's a moment of realization that I think everyone realizes that all video is montage. It is always editing, and that many films or videos are edited to produce what's often called a sutured narrative, so that you actually can't tell that it's, quote, edited. It almost as they say, sort of, it hides the seams of its editing in order to create a nice, coherent story. And what I have always been interested in is how much this form and the playing around with editing as a form becomes a way of thinking about social intervention. And you know, part of it for me is about sharing content that sometimes disrupts that sutured narrative of a story, so that that when one thinks one understands, say, this context, this story, this person, and that it's sort of given and natural and normal, that there is a playing around with the editing can actually prompt a viewer to question how clear and given any particular reality is. So playing with editing, to me, also becomes an artist's way of asking questions about the reality that's getting depicted. And that there too, when we talk about social issues that are super, super complicated, that are historic, that are global, or that are, as we sometimes say, structural. Say if we talk about something like structural racism, or we talk about something like ecology or the environment, which is something that is, touches, people in the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere, that touches you intimately in terms of how you breathe, and much more widely in terms of how factories emit toxins, that the small and the big, the near and the far, the past and the present are all implicated in the biggest of social issues, whether it's racism or gender discrimination or the environment. And the thing about mixing and editing, mixing in terms of non-sutured, as well as layering, the masking, and putting more than one reality together, to me, it becomes a formal way of capturing that complexity, as we see in your work, in the piece just now, of putting two different time zones at the same time, or as we saw with Andrew Tom's work of Student Here, which we showed on Tuesday, where he's using masking and layering in order to think with more complexity about the environment. That's what I love about this form as a in its capacities for social intervention, is that sort of juicy complexity.
Yeah. So continuity editing does the opposite. It smooths over the discrepancies of the world, and it smooths over the uncertainties and makes everything feel certain.
Right.
But we can go the other way as well and make room to visualize uncertainty, and that in turn helps us live with uncertainty in a new kind of way, and that's what's so important about carrying this medium forward, right? To increase our capacity to live with uncertainty. But we're going to come back to that topic a couple times. So there's a speaking of uncertainty, there's a few pieces that we really both saw as seminal, and your reading of them was inspiring to me, and I think vice versa as well. So there was Steve McQueen, who we approached from different angles as well, and there's a still here of his a wonderful piece which is based on an old Buster Keaton movie, where there's a house that seems to collapse, and the facade seems to hit the person standing in front of the facade, but there's a hole in the facade for a window, and the hole just happens to spare the person standing there. But the sense of threat and uncertainty is very palpable, and it reflects many people's experience with never quite feeling safe in the world. And so in this case, Steve McQueen was spared, but in many other cases, many other people might not have been. So it puts the viewer in the position of experiencing that uncertainty and that anxiety of like, oh no, what's going to happen next? And that led us to the concept of hard to see and hard to watch, which we spent a lot of time discussing. And one of the pieces that came up for us was Yoko Ono's Cut piece from the 1960s, early 1960s, which actually is a video documentation of a performance, right, like you mentioned earlier. And it's actually not even a video, it's a film documentation, and it was hard to watch that video even 50 years later. It was hard to watch because it felt so re-traumatizing and threatening, and in terms of what men will do to a woman's body, and how vulnerable and fragile Yoko Ono presented herself, and what risk she was taking, allowing people to come up to stage and cut her clothing off. Something that we probably couldn't imagine doing today even, but at the time it just was a feat of enormous courage. But it was also a mirror that reflected to a society back its own violence. And so that was so powerful about that piece, that the piece became a mirror that could throw our own violence into our own face and make us question it.
Absolutely, and she and others came in as early versions of performance that becomes video art, and then she and others came back later when we were thinking again about issues around social intervention and specifically around gender and sexual violence.
Yeah, yeah. Speaking of gender and sexual violence, not so much sexual, but just gender, we had this wonderful experience of sharing Rapture, a piece by Shirin Neshat, and we talked a lot about the two-channel nature of it, where one channel of the video would show men in Morocco organizing around a castle and doing things, and women in a desert in Morocco organizing among themselves as well, and how different these two experiences were. And as one of the cases where we were able to honor the Kramlich Foundation, which sponsors our course, and which also collected this piece, and which also presented the piece in a new public platform that is yet to be launched publicly, but that you helped develop. And so that was an important part of the course, to think about how video work actually reaches people, because it's all stuff that's hard to find sometimes. And so this is an attempt to make video art more public.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, an attempt, and I so appreciate students just getting a little bit of a exposure to some of the early attempts here, and so much of the feedback that they have already that's going to inform the next stage of development.
So we were beta testing.
Super fun. You were absolutely the beta.
Yeah. So, so then we got into deep topic of appropriation, and we sort of developed a new term that we both like to work with, of subversive appropriation, of an appropriation that is meant to destabilize the status quo of a given power structure, because somebody who's in a position of less power adopts symbols of power and flips them around to critique power.
And to acknowledge that it came about first under the juxtaposition of appreciation versus appropriation that you offered, where you really were trying to mark examples of appropriation that you and others thought were in need of critique. That there's forms of appropriation of taking what's not yours, of representing it without the consent of the entity or person or institution that you're borrowing from, that you were saying we need to critique.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there were other times that we find ourselves in the midst of sort of artists who are actually also poaching and, you could say, appropriating, or as another word you used, have an intertextual mix going on. That some want to actually value that move. So what's going on here? Isn't that contradictory? And I think that there still is a real question about how you know yourself to be in the presence of an appropriation that you want to really critique and end, versus a kind of appropriation that will say, okay, that's strategic, that's subversive. And to me, it always has to do with the power field. What's the power field in which this borrowing happens? That has to be at least really taken in and to think about deeply before you do any kind of analysis. But we didn't know we were going on this trajectory.
And
together.
that brought us straight into the conversation about Diamond Sea, the video by Doug Aitken, which is exhibited downstairs, which shows the landscape of extraction in Africa, in Namibia, where Germans extracted diamonds from the Namibian desert, and in the process also committed one of the first genocides of the 20th century, the genocide of the Herero people. And my feeling was that that conversation was not complete without a member of the Herero people speaking about their experience. And that's when we invited our colleague Kavena Hambira, who spoke about that experience in first-person terms, and I was a way to follow up on this concept of nothing about us without us, of really trying to bring in people to represent themselves, which video art in this case did not do, but it did bring us to an opportunity to question that and discuss that and unpack that a little bit, and so ultimately I thought that was very productive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So appropriation,
Oh,
and then
yeah, and then juxtapose the Aiken example from some of the historic, and this is just one, attempts when it comes to thinking about gender and video and film that interrogates issues around gender and sexuality, and where there's a great deal of what might be called appropriation here in, say, a drag context, and at the same time, what's the power field in which that's happening, and especially here as trans queer, trans women of color, with, as one of the interviewees says, that have barely two pennies to rub together, when they're quote appropriating and the imagery and apparel and behavior and voice of something more powerful, an entity more expressive, a fantasy. What's the power field in which that is happening, and do we think differently about that borrowing?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And in that context, there's a lot of student work that is really compelling as well.
Yes.
And I want to just...
That was really important, I think, to get this distinction, sorry to interrupt,
Yeah.
because so many students were doing their borrowing and doing a lot of mixing. And the last thing we wanted to do is shake a finger at some of this incredible creativity that they were producing. Yeah.
But in fact, their creativity often reflected two options that are really powerful. One, generational transfer, and there was this video I remember of a mother picking the needles off of a Nepal of a cactus, and the daughter doing the same thing but in a different place. And so it was such a beautiful image of, of course it was a transfer of culture, but it was within the culture, so it was deep appreciation. And then also Raquel Gifford's video about an appropriation of The Sims to tell a story about a man who's suffered from a broken heart and maybe was struggling to figure out how to lead a successful romantic life. But it was such a really beautiful moment of taking The Sims and turning it into something really quintessential and reflecting on a very specific set of cultural and musical experiences, because it was also a music video. So it was a wonderful intertextual process. So these were great examples of how to do it right? Yeah. Speaking of appropriation, more
on gender.
Yeah.
I think we can keep going, but
Okay.
if people remember that. Okay, yeah, so here's a last unexpected point of convergence that you started to think about Hito's work and Hito's thinking around the poor image very early in the semester.
Yeah.
And we had the students read about her in defense of the poor image.
Yeah.
And then when we start to conclude the semester with really thinking about circulation, we come back to the poor image, because what she is often talking about is the sort of saturation of a digital sphere, of our social sphere, and hence of our imagination, with all of these banal images that circulate, that are copied and recopied, that disintegrate, that, as she says, are bruised as they come through a sort of network, but that also that she is engaging with these poor images in order to help us think more critically about circulation. As a social system, as an ideological system, as a technology.
Yeah, and this makes me think about the power of circulation as amplifying, right? And but also the possibility that if we look at a poor image, we can trace back to its origin. We can ask questions. I think that's something we've done, maybe not explicitly, but now that I think about it implicitly, a video made us go back to a 19th century, 18th century painting, and the 18th century painting made us go back to a classical sculpture, and so the chain of references seems to always go from the original to the copy, but as scholars and as artists, we can also go the other way and say, where does this come from? And where does this come from again? And thereby go on deep journeys to understand the origin of things. And often takes us to places that are completely different. And so sometimes the circulation flips the meaning of an image, or it transforms it or also erases a lot of things that we'd rather not think about anymore because there may be, values have changed. And so but in going back, we realize that things actually often come from much more complex context than we'd like to think. So it's healthy to dive back in, right, and to do the research and figure out where things come from. Yeah. So that's from the Defense of the Poor Image. And do you want
the notion of circulationism that comes back and helps, brought a little bit of closure to our last unit, I thought.
Yeah. So then we're talking about the last section here. How are we doing with time?
We're doing okay. 1:15. So what we thought we would do is ask each other about what each of us is working on now. And as it turns out, both of us are working on environment and climate, we realized.
Yes.
Which, as you know from now with Greg's projects around sea level rise and projects around breathing and air quality, you really have been thinking about ecology and environment for a while from different trajectories, whereas mine probably comes in more tacitly and now much more specifically now. But.
Yeah. So that's a huge context, and I just want to mention that in that one concept that we finished on in the course was generative media, or media that keep generating themselves on the fly. And again, a student conversation reminded me of Wu Zhang's piece on whales in SF MoMA, which is a generative piece of media, meaning that the video is never quite the same. It's generated by a video game engine and potentially takes in to account new streams of data. And to me, that is very important, that we not only make media about the past, about fixed content, but also media that conveys the state of the world to us right now. So it has to do with data visualization, has to do with how are we going to learn about the weather tomorrow? How are we going to learn about the air quality? How are we going to learn about the next wildfire? And how are we going to be able to really see the signals that the world is giving us instead of squashing them with false certainties about how the future will be, really paying attention, really learning to listen to the world around us. And sometimes we need amplifiers, right? We use amplifiers to speak right now, and we use the speakers to amplify that voice, but we also need amplifiers to amplify the subtle signals in the world around us. And these are real-time signals. And past that, there's even the next step of predictive media that not only look at what's currently happening, and but look at what might happen next. And so looking into models and simulations. And so these are all very important aspects of learning to deal with a world that is offering us ever more uncertainty. And so what is the aesthetics of uncertainty? Professor Jackson?
Oh, no. Well, I mean, I guess when we were putting together this slide, and I was asking students to think about why it's hard to get people to be sensitized around climate in the first place. I think what's hard about it is that it's hard to take in and apprehend in total. As students were thinking about it, the scale at which it operates, the fact that what's happening way over there affects what's happening here. That what happened way back then is affecting things, the future generations that we cannot, that we are not inhabiting or would not connected to now. So the whole complexity of the thing is produces a great deal of uncertainty, or as also others have said, the fatigue of trying to understand it, or the fatigue of hearing about apocalypse, also all contribute to this being a hard issue. And I guess part of what's interesting, I think, about the arts is not only that the métier of the artists are to come in to solve or to clarify or simplify this complexity, but more to give different pathways in for coming to terms and understanding it. Also emotional pathways, different kinds of emotional affective pathways for holding really complicated, still ambiguous knowledge. And that seems really important for climate to me.
Yeah, that's sort of interesting. This idea of holding, like it's easy to hold on to something simple, and but it's much harder to put your arms around something complex. And if I even think about, a hug, it can be a hug to somebody who's falling apart, and you can feel the falling apart, and you still stay in there and keep hugging them, because that's what you do when you care for somebody, right? And so being there for the world in that sense, where it's not simple to hold on, but you have to hold on ever more so. And then we also learn to do that not alone, but together, to learn how to sort of hold on to complexities that are overwhelming us as a community. And so like you said earlier, the artist as the public servant can point out not only paths of disaster but also paths of new opportunity or new ability that needs to be developed to cope with things that we haven't had to cope with in a long time. Yeah. So we have some examples here.
Well, just a reminder of Jeffrey Gibson, who was one of our, incredible, distinguished visitors, and how much the form, actually, to recall what I was saying earlier around montage, how much the forms that he was creating that both engage with issues around climate, but as well as indigenous epistemologies that understand climate, how much the montage aesthetics, the masking and layering, the sort of playing around with editing, and the abstracting of what might be, what might have been a sort of literal image, all contributed, I think, to creating some really complicated work. I guess in the next slide, I think we have a video version of it. Can you? Okay. Oh no, there we go. Just a reminder of this installation, which perhaps a couple of you got to see, and that he referenced this alongside other pieces that borrowed from this kind of aesthetic. Sorry about the other people, but what struck me there is how much he decided, for instance, to allow the geometries of a native aesthetic, that sort of geometric set of symbols, to layer it over the representation of the natural environment, in order to it really starts to become something that's much different from a typical, say, nature documentary,
Absolutely.
which might be in that mode, and in order to ask a different set of questions about what worldviews might be operating at the same time in this landscape. There is also even a capturing there of, if you do it one more time.
Ooh.
There you go. If there's a capturing there of there's a singer, Joan Kelly, who's an earth singer, who was originally represented as a figure. There she is, right there. You see and at one point he was going to have her perform as a singer in the video in this. So you would see her face, you would see her gestures as she's singing. And then he realized that she needed to be abstracted too. And he created that geometry, and so that she starts to blend into the landscape. And in a context where an environmental, a post-Anthropocene imagination actually needs the so-called human figure to be less central in order to understand the relation amongst all different kinds of living things, it also seemed really important that he uses, again, this formal technique around masking and layering in order to actually sort of obscure and decenter that human figure. So I love that.
I love that too. That's an important point, and it makes me think about conversations we had with Jeffrey, where he was telling us, sometimes people say the meaning of my work is not really clear, and it's just style and so forth. And I said that's not how I see it. I think it's not about meaning. I think it's about function, and it's something we talked about more recently as well. That the way the work functions is actually reclaims territory for Native Americans that was lost. And so it reclaims lost territory quite literally by putting the tribal ethnic patterns on top of the landscape as we normally see it. It reframes and reclaims that land for native territory. And so that's such a powerful move, and it functions in the world simply by hanging up a picture of his or showing a video. He's reclaiming territory, and so it functions in the world in a very direct way.
Yeah. And so for me, I'm coming at this more as a scholar, a writer, a convener, and teacher, and I'm working on books and on a book around climate and the arts. And next fall, I'll be teaching an undergraduate course that focuses only on ecology across the arts. So that's where I come at it. But you, as an artist, perhaps you can share a little bit more about what you're working on now, because it's work that people like you make, that people like me like to write about and teach.
Oh, thank you. Well, likewise, the inspiration continues in all directions. So we have more video here. So do you want to talk about this one? No. Okay.
We can fast forward across. These are things that will end up in my book, but down the road.
Okay.
But let's look at your work.
All right. So
Fast forward. Yeah. There you go.
So this was a slide about generative art, and so indeed I'm interested in making more generative work as well. This is a work by Ian Cheng that always progresses algorithmically, and we had this picture here. Do you want to?
Let's go to your work.
Okay, so I'm just gonna introduce this by saying a couple things. First of all, I want to acknowledge one collaborator that I work with often over many years, Niemeyer. You're in the room there, and not only did you help me understand what audio can do for art, but also you were involved in setting up the wonderful speakers in this auditorium for Meyer Sound. So I'm really thrilled to be able to share video that sounds great in this wonderful space. And so I want to acknowledge my colleague Lisa Wymore, who's a resident of Santa Rosa and who's also a professor here, of course. But in the fires of recent times, her family lost one home, and there's many people like her who lost homes, and some people recover really easily because they say, oh, we have insurance, we can just rebuild, right? And other people really can't recover at all because they have no insurance, and they just have to move on and find a different future elsewhere, and that's called displacement. And so the impact of fires on people can vary tremendously. And so when I wanted to visualize working with Lisa and also with people in Sonoma County who were affected by fires directly, when we wanted to visualize a memory for fires, a memorial for fires, we had to ask this question about how a fire means something very different for different people. And also fires that are past oftentimes are quickly forgotten, but the fires in the future, we don't even want to think about them. And so there's this gap between the past and the future that we have to operate in, and the present gives us a chance to re-articulate fire policies and safety policies around power lines, but also ask questions about, well, if there's a fire and then we complain about the smoke for weeks in the Bay Area and we all are so outraged about it, we don't realize that ultimately it's us who created that fire, right? The PG&E provides power and should do so safely, but we're the ones consuming power. So without us, there would be no PG&E. And so when we try to blame somebody, we have to look into that mirror again and say, how can I take more responsibility for the future of the air quality in my neighborhood and in my planet and so forth. And so something simple as turning off the lights or when you don't need them anymore, or thinking about different ways of saving energy can really be a part of a future energy policy that would reduce the prevalence of wildfires. And so this brief video that I'm going to show is just a clip that is supposed to illustrate a VR experience that we're working on this summer. And the VR experience brings together lots of stories about fires and lots of locations that were scanned with LiDAR to show what is left after fire has passed, but also to show potential new buildings. And so we really like this idea of point clouds, because point clouds are showing points in space that are associated with objects, and but also they're showing a lot of space in between. And normally point clouds get rendered as flat surfaces, but if we leave them as point clouds, then we can see kind of the uncertainty of perception and memory and experiences inscribed in the landscape itself. So what you're going to see is a point cloud that is constantly animating of a site called the Soda Rock Winery, which has sadly burned down in a Kincaid fire in 2019, and which has not yet been rebuilt, but hopefully it's going to be rebuilt soon. And so, should we play it?
So yeah, and I just want to say again, so a point cloud would normally be flattened.
Yeah, so imagine I scanned us as a point cloud, and then I had points on my suit and on everything here, and those points would then become parts of a triangle, and that triangle would be rendered as a flat surface, and then it looks like the thing that was scanned, more or less. And but if we don't render it as a triangle, but just show the points, then we can sort of see the space in between.
So it's akin then to not producing a sutured film.
It's exactly that. It's exactly making space for the uncertainty of perception itself. And yeah, so well said.
So it's montage in new form.
It's montage at the level of the molecule almost, right?
Yeah.
It's not exactly the molecule, but it looks like the molecule.
Yeah,
Right?
got it.
Yeah. So, okay, let's take a look at it.
This building, the first section of it was built in 1869. It was the Soda Rock General Store. So it was the hardware, the grocery store, the post office, the stagecoach stop, the sheriff's office, and the elementary school. This area here and all the way over to where it drops off there, this was our main ballroom, and it would seat 250 people. So we used to have a lot of weddings here, and and we couldn't come in here because it was all full of debris and everything. Well, this happened in the middle of the night. It was like 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning. But the fire was going on. We could see it from Healdsburg. We could see these hills on fire. And then we had to evacuate Healdsburg. So we left town, and then, you know, I got an email from a friend saying, hey, the winery burned down. I'm like, what? Something incredible.
That's it.
Oh, beautiful.
I just want to acknowledge that the sound was made by Jane Bland, who was also involved. Her family was also involved in the Paradise Fire, and so everybody who's working on this has direct experience with the matter.
Well, I think it's just such an amazing piece to end on, both in terms of in a course on video art in context that's actually about engaging and reframing this current context. And in so many ways, there is something about the point cloud, about seeing all of those points, that then we can both have the sense of a kind of given reality here, but also the unhinging of not seeing discrete objects allows us to see the relationship between any object or person and a wider world. You know, you could say also that we all are connected through a whole ream of molecules and entities and systems at the cellular level that we're not registering at the moment that we engage with each other or walk down the street or walk in a mountain, and that they're all operating. So your piece really sensitizes us to that reality, that scientific reality, but in this aesthetically provocative way.
Yeah, we're all point clouds. Everything else is an illusion. So we all are, we are meshes that are intermesh, and
mesh is a good one for this one.
And we intermesh with each other in such wonderful ways. And at this point, we can shift and say that it was really wonderful to be able to intermesh with you all and with your thinking and creativity. And I hope that this conversation here helped you get a sense of overview and context of what we've trying to achieve all semester long. And I think it's a great moment to thank Sachi and Zihan for helping us make this happen. Please come up.
Could Sachi and Zihan come up? Who've been incredible too, with everybody having different skills that they bring together and skills that we learned from each other. It's been wonderful to have this full team.
So I have a question for you all, which is, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. But the question is, what did you get out of it? How does this intermesh with your purpose in life and what you're trying to do with your future studies? Oh, there you go. Yeah.
I guess for me, it was really amazing to see how interdisciplinary art can be and how so many of you brought all of your majors and studies and interests to the pieces you made, and also just how quickly you really absorbed the material and dove right in. That was fantastic, and thank you guys for all of your participation. I learned so much from you, and I love teaching this class. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's so hard to frame it into a nugget of what I learned, but I think that the most important thing for me is performing the interlocutor or the translator, and the most difficult thing was something that meant the world to me. How do I convince you that it's important? And that's the struggle, and sometimes it's more successful and sometimes it's less successful. So yeah, that's the constant thing that I've been grappling with throughout the semester, and maybe we'll just highlight the successful moments. So I felt like when I was in the exhibition at Apichatpong, speaking about the work to all of you, and in that moment, there was that yes, this matters, and this is why it matters. I felt that sense that there was that successful communication that happened. And I look forward to producing more moments like that. And thanks for giving me the opportunity to practice in that pedagogical skill. Yeah. And I also like to thank the team, Taylor and Elle, who is the most consistent and dedicated student of the class, because they are here vacuuming the hall right before and they stay on after. Yeah, they are like the invisible. We are talking about making the invisible visible, the particles that are floating in the space, like in Morakot, and they are the invisible labor that support the entire class. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Along with those in the booth as well, who are recording this and making things available here, it has been, as we've thanked all throughout the semester, the BAMPFA staff. But let's do it super officially now. Thanks so much for the BAMPFA staff collaboration that we've had here. They've been incredible support.
Yes, thank you, BAMPFA. All right, so I guess we're done. So wait. Can we hug it out here? Thank you.
All right. Okay. And thanks to all of you for your incredible work. It's been great to get to know you through your work. And we hope you'll keep going, learning, and apply more of what you might have experienced here to other contexts. Have a great summer, and we look forward to your final projects.
Onwards. Take care.